Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Thanks for listening to the show. Join your hosts, Bill Alvstad and Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Hey, hi, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk Seahawks football. We've got a great show today. We're going to be talking coaches for the Seattle Seahawks. We've got most of the staff now built. Mike Macdonald has, and John Schneider, of course, have made their choices on all the assistant coaches, the offensive coordinator, the defensive coordinator, assistant head coach, some of the lower profile assistants. We've got a good show to talk about it all today, how it works together and how it works with our current roster and potentially in the draft, a little conversation around that. Although I will say this, we haven't really had a chance to formulate how this affects how they look at players and so forth. We'll be building on that as time goes on here as we get closer to free agency in the draft. But welcome in, Keith.
Yeah. So this is one of those about time kind of moments where normally when a guy like McDonald is hired, he's got his staff at least partially figured out before he accepts the job. He's got, he's talked to guys, he's got his list put together and they're ready to roll. And it really felt like he went into this not having any of that decided and really taking their time trying to figure out who they wanted and what they wanted to do and what scheme they wanted to run on offense. And it was, very odd, a very unique, staff build, more so than I've seen. And
why do you think that was, Keith? Just that basic idea that he just didn't seem ready to build a staff, or
I think it has to do
prepared.
With Seattle. I think it has to do with Seattle, and I think it has to do with the fact that Schneider has control over the coaching staff, not just the head coach, but the coaching staff. And I think that it was a situation where the two of them needed to work together to build this staff. And there were guys that I'm sure McDonald wanted that he needed to sell to Schneider. And it became just a different process.
So in your opinion, and we can talk about the actual coaches in a second, but in your opinion, did that process serve Seattle well? Did it work well? What did you kind of take away from that process that really took almost 3 weeks to complete?
So what I've seen is that a lot of times when these things do happen fast, guys hire their friends, people they know. They all have the same coaching tree. They all have the same ideas. It's not a diverse staff in terms of thought process. And this coaching staff is not going to be that. There is going to be a lot of different voices, a lot of different ideas. It's going to be a kind of unique situation. Now, does that serve Seattle well? I think it can. I think if you had an experienced head coach that everyone respected and would listen to, you would say guaranteed it does. But with a first-time head coach, are people going to not feel heard because other people's ideas are being taken over theirs? Are people going to be aggressive and think that they can dominate a conversation when they don't need to? There's personalities in fact all of this, and until we've seen it happen, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be the idea farm that we want it to be.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly room for skepticism here. Basically, we've got a rookie head coach, a rookie offensive coordinator, rookie defensive coordinator. Leslie Frazier's importance as a longtime defensive coordinator and assistant head coach now in this regime seems to be greater than ever, really. As far as the diversity of ideas and all that stuff, man, how could it not be the most diverse thing ever? I mean, it's just kind of crazy how this thing all came together. There's no real rhyme or reason. There's no, ideal match. Now, Seattle, I think went through a really decent process with the head coach. The patience, I think, paid off for them, at least getting a guy that was up and coming, viewed mostly in consensus as being one of the premier gets this coaching cycle, and a real well-respected defensive mind in the league. But after that, I'm not sure that they ended up getting everyone that they wanted. I think they really wanted Mike Kafka, the offensive coordinator
from
the
did.
Giants.
And
but
when
they didn't get him, they had
move.
to pivot. Yeah,
yep.
When they didn't get him, they had to pivot. They they tried to go get the offensive pass game coordinator for the Detroit Lions. That didn't look like it was going to work. He just wasn't ready.
Yeah, he was interviewed. Basically, I think it felt to John too much like Shane Waldron, a guy who has had the job, knows the offense, all that kind of stuff, but is he truly ready to be the leader of that entire unit and have that autonomy? And I think they moved away from that. They talked to Chip Kelly. I think that had more to do with Chip Kelly trying to get out of UCLA. As we've seen now,
he worked hard to do that. He took a step down to get out. He took
a step down. He took a demotion from head coach to offensive coordinator, still in college, to go from
had a great
UCLA
program, nonetheless,
to Ohio State. But basically, he wanted out of UCLA with and there was no stopping that was going to happen. And he finally found a landing spot. But ultimately, it comes back down to Ryan Grubb, and this is one of the first people that Seattle talked to. And his name just never went away. And eventually he's the guy who got it. And I read a thing today that said that when he went to Alabama to join Caleb DeBoer's staff there and basically follow DeBoer from Washington to Bama, he was on the recruiting trail, and there's a 30-day transfer window. And he was working like crazy because that's what he was hired to do down there. And he was doing that. And it kind of, he wasn't going to not do that job to flirt with another job, because if he ends up there, he wanted to have done that job well. And then as that transfer window, wrapped up, he began returning phone calls again, and the Seahawks got him back up here and got him on staff. So it is interesting that despite the fact that he was doing the work and doing the recruiting, and he was out working for Alabama never announced his hire. It was almost as if they knew this was a temporary thing that's going to happen for a couple of weeks, and then he's going to be gone. And so that, I don't know, I just felt the whole thing interesting. I actually like the Ryan Grubb hire. I think you're like, oh, he's a first-time coordinator. He's not a first-time coordinator. He's a first-time NFL coordinator, but
that's what I mean.
But he's been coordinating an offense for a while.
Yes. So successful, very successful in college, but never coached in the NFL. That's why I think I'm viewing this with slight skepticism. Now, I'm excited for the hire. Obviously, it's something new. But it's unknown. And will it work? Does he have knowledge? Does he have, or will he hire a staff that has knowledge of other NFL defenses and what those defenses want to do to stop him being successful in the NFL? Does he have a counter to that? Is he the kind of coordinator that's going to plan and scheme for each team? Or is he just going to have a generic scheme that that we've experienced in the past?
We can tell by what he did at Washington that he's a guy that's going to scheme for each team. We know that he did that at the college ranks, and we know that is part of the reason why they have an associate head coach or an assistant head coach who is a defensive mind, is to come in and to be that guy that Grubb can bounce ideas off of. That he can go in.
Coach.
Well, yeah, but I mean, just mean like, even if the head coach is off doing their own thing, you've always got one or the other available to come in and be like, okay, here's how I would attack you in this. What are you going to do against it? And you've got you've got those defensive minds that he can work with. So I like this hire. I like it's an interesting scheme. We'll see how well it translates. I mean, we've seen
let's
other
talk about
teams
that a little bit.
Really want it to work at the next level, but it hasn't always. But part of that had to do with the coaches that were involved. So
it's a very pass-heavy offense.
It is.
Ranked sixth in the in college football in yards per game, 487 sounds great. It is. He got them to the national championship game, sixth in scoring. Michael Penix was the quarterback, led all of college football in passing yards per game, 355. Called pass plays 61.8% of the time, which I think is very significant.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also the quarterback's coach there, so helped bring Michael Penix. Penix was just really phenomenally balanced as far as 2 years at Washington, virtually the same sort of stats both years. 67 touchdown passes in 28 games over 2 seasons. That's pretty amazing. But my skepticism, I guess, does come with his ability to adapt, in the NFL with the speed that the NFL defenses have and so forth. It just kind of really shocks you, I would imagine, if you haven't been there before, just surrounded by elite players on defense that are really trying to stop you. So I'm hoping for the best. I just know that, succeeding in the NFL, everyone's excited about this hire and should be. But I don't know that it was necessarily the first choice. And B, there's just no way to predict success, I think, with this hire. There's a lot of college coaches that come into the NFL and fail. There's a few that succeed. And I hope that he's one of the few that is successful and puts together a nice long run in Seattle. That's definitely the plan, but anything can happen. So
a lot of the college coaches that come to the NFL and fail are head coaches.
True.
And that's the different thing. And when we actually talk scheme here, we've got there's some similarities to Cliff Kingsbury's offense, and what he ran in Arizona. It's not the same scheme, but they're within the same
concepts.
Umbrella. Yeah. Grubb's going to run the ball more. He provides more short, easy completions than Kingsbury did. He doesn't rely so much on the athleticism of the quarterback to extend plays. There's lots to like in his version of what they're doing. But Kingsbury's coaching stuff failed not because of the scheme so much as Kingsbury is just not a very good coach. He wasn't a good college coach. He got fired as a college coach and then instantly hired to be a pro coach. The system never, that decision-making process was weird by Arizona. And of course it didn't work. Whereas Grubb isn't coming up to be a head coach. He's coming up to be a coordinator. He's got a head coach and an assistant head coach to lean on and let them do those things. His job is to just scheme, to work with his position coaches and get, to teach and get what they want out of those players and to figure out how to. He's done that really well. And it wasn't people will say, oh, well, of course he looked good. He had Penix, because Penix was freaking awesome. But go look what he did at San Diego State before he had Penix.
Or North Dakota. Yeah.
Yeah. He has, his offense has worked and done well everywhere. He's tailored what he does to the talent on his roster. And that is something that the Seahawks need.
They also benefited, Keith. I want to talk to you about this because this is kind of where you love to talk about offensive line. He had the best offensive line in college football. And I understand, too, that former Washington offensive line coach Scott Huff is following him back
Mm-hmm.
from Alabama to the Seahawks to be the offensive line coach. I think that's great news.
I
He's
really
been
like that,
Washington's
especially with
offensive line
this
coach
group.
for 7 years, not just under Grubb.
Yeah. I
But they won the
really
Joe
like,
Moore Award as the top offensive line in college football, which I think is going to be hugely important.
I like that hire. I like it because one is track record of success, but the other thing is one of the things that Washington has done well is to really teach and to really coach up their offensive linemen. Because their offensive linemen aren't all like 4 and 5 star recruit offensive linemen. Some of them, there's a couple that were like, thought of to be,
Troy
guys
Faulkner.
that were NFL track when they were coming out of high school, but a bunch of them were 3-star recruits. They were guys that could have got on elsewhere, probably couldn't have gotten on it at Ohio State or anything like that, and they got turned into the best offensive line in college football. That's a lot of teaching. Now you've got to look at this Seattle's offensive line, and you've got 2 tackles that just finished their second year. You've got a guard that just finished his first year. You've got a center who just finished his first year, but only played about a third of the season. And these are young guys. These are guys that need coaching. These are guys that need to continue to improve. And you just hired someone who can teach.
Yeah. I was worried
initially,
Keith, because Cunningham left and when Shane Waldron left. And I thought he was a pretty decent coach, getting the most out of, with what he could, if you factor in injuries.
Dickerson?
Dickerson. Andy Dickerson.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought he did well with what he could do with the players that he had, given the injury situations and so forth, and the multiple starting combinations that we had to have throughout the year. So I was a little concerned that he left, and but now I think I feel really good actually about this hire. That he can come in, he can relate to players. He knows how to, if they draft players, I think they're going to be able to really kind of look for the offensive line that fits what Grubb is trying to do. So that part of it is kind of coordinated. I feel good about that.
Yeah. I liked Andy Dickerson. I thought he did a good job his first year, or no, it was the second year, the year with the 2 rookie tackles. There were points last year where I'm like, wow, you've got both of your starting tackles out, and the offensive line looks competent. Like you guys clearly doing something right. But then you look at overall, you've got Cross and Lucas, and you've got Bradford, who played freaking really well as a rookie. And, you got other pieces in there, including Damian Lewis, who's probably going to get paid this offseason.
And Oluwatimi won the Outland Trophy Award.
Yeah. And so you've got talent, and that offensive line was not good overall. It was the weak link of Seattle's offense.
I agree.
And so how do you have, I get that there were injuries and guys in and out and there's no continuity and all of that, but if you've got that much talent, you got to be able to get more out of it. And so I came away from this season kind of disappointed in Dickerson and his overall job that he did. Now, like I said, early in the season, when it was a disaster in terms of injuries, I thought he held things together and did some good things. But once everyone started to get healthy, it felt like the offensive line got worse as the talent improved. And that was a problem.
For me, I thought it was, I put it more on Shane Waldron than you do a little bit, based on our conversations we've had over time, in that Shane Waldron knew we had offensive line problems, but didn't scheme that way. He schemed in a way that we had max protect all the time, or guys were going to be able to hold up, against the NFC West defenses and so forth. And I think put Gino in compromises that maybe other quarterbacks. Now, we talked briefly before the show about getting the ball out on time and so forth. We're going to talk about quarterbacks here in a second as it relates to fitting into this offense. I disagree a little bit, only that Gino has shown he can get the ball out when in certain situations and so forth. But I think Shane Waldron was not asking him to get the ball out quickly. You'd mentioned the idea that Pete Carroll was saying,
disagree.
get the ball out quick. And I think
So
Shane Waldron wasn't hearing that. Shane Waldron designed so many throws down the field that required a lot of time to set up that I don't think so.
I think there were some of that where you've got four guys running routes and they're all going deep. There was some of that. There's always some of that. But what you also had was a lot of plays where there were guys open early and Gino didn't get the ball out of his hands. You had Shane Waldron in his press conferences saying he's got to get the ball out faster. We need him to just trust what he's seeing.
I think that was an answer to critics. I think that was answer to critics, his own critics, as opposed to, I don't know. I don't think he was standing up for Gino.
Pete Carroll was saying it. Shane Waldron was saying it. You and I were both saying it. He's got to get the ball. But now you're hearing
guys like Jackson Smith and Jigba kind of throw his old coach under the bus, Shane Waldron, as far as, some issues there.
True.
So
I get that. And I'm not saying that Waldron was perfect, because he was far from that. But to say that, did this give Gino a pass on it, I think is very problematic. He was not the only problem, but he was a big part of that problem.
So one of the biggest questions in this entire offseason is what to do with Gino and what kind of quarterback fits in this scheme, and would Mike Macdonald have on his team to lead him? His first year in coaching an NFL team, wants some success there right away. You've got an offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb who runs a certain scheme. Does Gino fit that scheme? Is there a better veteran quarterback out there that might? Is there a college quarterback, Michael Penix, maybe others that Ryan Grubb would want to have Seattle draft? Lots of questions there. Your initial thoughts around Geno Smith?
My initial thoughts on Geno Smith is that when he was at West Virginia, he was in a similar offense, and he looked really good. His time in the pros, he has shown a lot of hesitancy, a lot of unwillingness to trust what he sees pre-snap and get the ball out of his hands quickly, and things like that. And it has led to problems. And this offense, he's going to need to get the ball out of his hands very quickly on every play. And that is not what we've seen Geno Smith capable of doing on a regular basis, which means that I think that while there's reason to believe that he'll be better in this offense than under Waldron this last year, he's still not an ideal quarterback for it. And he's not even I just think that he's a guy that is not a good fit for what Grubb's going to want to do. That doesn't mean he's not going to be around for the first year. I mean, Matt Hasselbeck was not an ideal fit for what Pete Carroll and company wanted to do in 2010, but they kept him around and let him play out his contract the year because they needed a leader. They needed someone to help hold the offense together on the field. And that's what we're kind of looking at as a possibility with Geno, is you may get 1 year with Geno running the offense just to help everything fall into place, because you need a transition year to get some of the other puzzle pieces put in there in order to make the offense work the way you want it to. And having a guy that can be a leader and do some of those things, there's some value there. But ultimately, the idea that he's going to be the guy, I think he's not going to be the guy.
Not long term.
No, at most 1 year. And again, it might come down to he's going to be the guy in training camp in the first 6 weeks. And that's it. And you don't pay a guy $30 million to do that for 6 weeks.
One of the things, you highlighted some of the things that Geno struggles with. I'll highlight some of the things he does well. He's a veteran now. He's seen a lot of the defenses in the NFL. He knows the defenses in the NFC West really well. I think he can help transition, a new quarterback into this role. I think He's also very good in a leadership role and putting his ego aside to be able to do that. I think he did that with Drew Lock. I think he can do that with a younger quarterback. You need that on a team, especially with this rookie coaching staff. So I think a player like Gino has tremendous value that way. And then the long ball stuff, fitting balls into tight windows, picking his spots and so forth. I think with a new offensive coordinator, I'd be interested to see Gino operate, in a different environment. We know he's got the weapons. We've got a good running back tandem. We've got 3 wide receivers currently, depending on what they do with Tyler Lockett. And I think, he could be successful right away. Help Seattle be successful right away out of the gate. I think if you put a rookie back there, you never know. I mean, you could end up, looking really good or likely looking really bad.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with that. But I'm just like,
and the reason I said long ball is because the University of Washington under Ryan Grubb was one of the best long ball teams in the league. They averaged their yards per play, yards per throw average, I think, was number 2 in the entire nation.
Yeah, so you're looking at air yards per attempt. Basically, it's where the receiver is when you target, because it basically takes all yak or yards after catch out of it, and you look at just air yards per attempt, and it was pretty high. And you need a guy that can get the ball downfield. That part of that was because they had the offensive line to do it, and part of that
they were also number 2 in sacks, right? They had some of the longest throws per average, but number 2 in sacks overall allowed, which tells you everything you need to know about how that offense worked.
Yeah, and so you ended up with you had a quarterback that did certain things really well, and Grubb tailored what they did to the quarterback who did certain things extremely well. And he also had wide receivers that were phenomenal.
Absolutely. That's
but they were phenomenal compared to the defensive backs they were playing against.
That's true.
Seattle's got some phenomenal wide receivers, but there's some really damn good defensive backs in this league too.
So speaking of defense, before we get to the defensive side of the ball and those coaches, let's talk for a second about the other quarterbacks that Seattle might take a look at now because Ryan Grubb is the offensive coordinator and the direction the franchise is going. Anyway, they're really kind of stepping out. You see John Schneider now really kind of making this thing from scratch. I mean, you got rookie head coach, rookie offensive coordinator, rookie defensive coordinator. Do they go with a rookie quarterback to kind of just throw everything out the window and start over?
I think they draft one. That doesn't mean he starts right away. I think that if it's not Gino, if they for some reason they decide within the next week, because the deadline's coming up in the next week, to move on just for the financials of it, then it's probably going to be Locke, who's the guy. But
if you were to look at the draft based on where we're drafting, either in the first or third rounds, what are like 2 or 3 of the quarterbacks that you think might work well in this scheme?
Honestly, the guy that, Caleb Williams could play in any scheme. Drake May can play in any scheme. Those guys are freaking phenomenal. Jaden Daniels would be great, but those guys are going 1, 2, and 5. All 3 of those guys are going top 5. Seattle's going to have to either give up everything to trade up that far, or they're not getting them. And so now if you're looking for system guys that will play well in this system, specifically, people will say Penix. Yeah. Honestly, Bo Nix, I think, is a better fit because of his lack of injury history. His mobility is better. He doesn't throw the deep ball as well as Penix, because honestly, nobody throws the deep ball as well as Penix. But his, NCAA record for completion percentage is there for a reason. And he can get the ball out quick. He's got the athleticism to extend plays when needed. I just think he's a really good fit for what Grubb does, especially when you look at not just the 2 years at Washington, but at San Diego State and North Dakota. And he'll be available He's not going in the top 15. He'll be available at 16. He may be available at 20, which means you can move down, get an extra pick, and still get a guy. And so out of all the quarterbacks, he's a guy that I would keep an eye on.
I think McCarthy at Michigan is another guy.
Yep, he's the other guy. The thing about McCarthy that I question a little bit is simply that he doesn't have a big arm. He throws with anticipation, he throws with accuracy, but he doesn't have the big arm. And you know that Grubb wants to go downfield. Maybe not as much as he did at Washington because he had Penix right? But he's going to want to go downfield at some point. And McCarthy just doesn't have the big arm to do that. So I'm going to trust Schneider because Schneider's been right on quarterbacks. He's shown that he can evaluate quarterbacks. So if he says that McCarthy can do it, then I'm going to assume that he can. But he just doesn't have the strong arm that the other 5 top quarterbacks do. Honestly, though,
I want to see at the combine because he wasn't asked to throw a lot at Michigan deep. That's a great running game and a short game with the tight ends there and so forth. He's a young guy, just 21 years old. There's a lot of upside there. There's a lot of buzz building. The youngest quarterback,
youngest early round, high ranking quarterback in a long time. He just turned 21. There's a lot of growth left.
And I think he's he makes the throws and he makes them accurate. So that's why I want to see him at the combine spin the thing because I think he raises his stock. I think he ends up being in a conversation. Now currently, he's all over the place, from the early to mid second round to the, first part of the third round. And I think that he's going to end up going potentially earlier than, I'm not going to say Penix. There's some ACL concerns with Penix, and he's going to have some medicals, and they're going to have to show up really well at the combine. But McCarthy's going to be one of those risers, along with Spencer Rattler. I don't know if Spencer's going to be able to run an offense like
with
this.
His accuracy. He's too erratic with his accuracy.
A guy like McCarthy is probably one of the most accurate passers in this draft, other than the guys at the top.
Well, and
so it'll be interesting.
The guy who set the NCAA record for completion percentage, who would be next.
Right.
But McCarthy is he is not a quarterback for everybody. There are certain teams that will look at him and just they're like, no, he's not our guy. They'd rather have a guy like Rattler who has the big arm and all the athletic traits and all of that, and hope that you can get his feet squared away so you can improve his accuracy slightly. But this is a system that could run really well with a guy like McCarthy. So I would definitely keep an eye on him. And you're right. He's a guy that I've seen him, somewhere from the end of round 1 into round 3 as far as projections. I think it's going to be mid round 1 when it's all said and done, which guess where Seattle picks.
Right. I agree.
Round 1.
His old coach said that he wouldn't be surprised if he was the first quarterback taken in this draft class. Shockingly.
Yeah.
You take that with a grain of salt, but nonetheless, when Harbaugh says that, he's not just blowing smoke. He believes that the guy is talented enough to be thought of.
I think he's blowing smoke and trying to help his guy out. Because no one thinks that he is on par with Williams and May. The only person who thinks that is Harbaugh, if Harbaugh thinks that, and I don't believe he does.
Okay, so let's talk about the we kind of talked about the offensive line coach a little bit. Let's switch our focus to the defensive side. Seattle, in the same day they announced an offensive coordinator, that very morning they announced the former Dallas Cowboys defensive line coach Aiden Dirty is going to be the defensive coordinator for Seattle. He's not going to call the defense on Sundays. That's going to be Mike Macdonald's job, but he's going to be the the defensive coordinator calling all the shots in waiting while he learns the job and kind of comes up internally from his position there in Dallas. Now he was well thought of there. He'd been with Dallas for a while. Defensive line coach under Dan Quinn. I like the hire. I like
that he's under the Dan Quinn tree because of the things that Quinn does with his offset line and that kind of stuff. That's going to
argue with the success in Dallas with their defensive lines. It's been great.
And all of that. But when it comes to game planning and actually being in the meeting on Monday afternoon, trying to figure out, okay, here's what we're going to show. Here's what we're going to implement with the players tomorrow. He's the third guy on the list because Macdonald's going to have the most say. Leslie Frazier is going to be second, and the defensive coordinator in this case is going to be third, and he's not calling plays.
And he's probably going to coach the defensive line at the same time.
Yeah, or at least partially coach the defensive line. Even if they have a DL coach, he'll be out there doing that. So you know what I mean? Like he's defensive coordinator by name, and he'll be doing a lot of those jobs, but he is not your typical defensive coordinator in terms of responsibility.
And Mike Macdonald alluded to that in his press conference. He said, I'm going to be calling the plays, at this point, and we'll bring a guy along. And at some point, if it makes sense, we'll transition to that player or that coach calling the plays. So I think in that window of looking at this thing, it makes sense. I don't know anything about him as far as a guy, and obviously well respected. But Dan Quinn wanted him. Dan Quinn wanted him. But Dan Quinn wanted him not as defensive coordinator, but as defensive line coach. Like he was trying really hard to get Dallas to release him so that way he could go and steal him for in Washington. That tells you a lot. Like that, that Quinn was like basically trying to get this guy out of his contract so he can come with him to Washington. And Dallas said no, because it would have been a lateral move. And Seattle goes, okay, well, we'll hire you, but we're going to give you that defensive coordinator title so that it is even though he doesn't have the defensive coordinator responsibilities, so it's not really the promotion. And he wasn't under consideration in Dallas to be the defensive coordinator for them. Obviously.
No, he was.
He wasn't ready for that yet. And Jones wouldn't have made that selection anyway. Jones looking for a splashier name, always. So
and he got one.
Right.
But yeah,
so to me, it's just it's another assistant on the staff that has done really well with defensive line. I'm happy about that. It adds to the pile of competent coaches with new ideas, with proven success in the NFL on our staff now. There's no more Clint Hurt. I don't, you really take a look at Hurt under Pete Carroll, and you take a look at our defensive lines. We never really had great defensive lines. They were always okay. We didn't draft particularly high to put players onto the defensive line. We brought over some players on trades and so forth. And in retrospect, we were just middling. We were average, really. Mm-hmm. And so to get somebody to come in that's actually been very successful with very successful scheme and players is exciting for me.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what the Clint Hurt hire still is frustrating because they had other guys that were available. I mean, at one point he had Ed Donatel on staff, but then when they decided not to give him the title, he's like, well, screw this, and left. And that kind of stuff. So you look at overall with all of that, it's there's a level of like frustration as far as why was he given that nod and all of that. And it came down to like they wanted a scheme. So they went and they promoted a guy who knew the scheme, even if he wasn't.
Yes.
He didn't know it well enough to do it and didn't.
Right. He was like the third choice. They wanted Sean Desai, but at that point, I think they'd already promoted Hurt. They hired Desai. So they kind of worked in
Desai also
together.
didn't work out either here or in Philly. So
right.
But yeah. And so you kind of just look at, I don't know, shouldn't be like the goal here of this show is not to talk about Clint Hurt. I like what they've done as far as the defensive. You've got Macdonald, who is got his own scheme. It's the scheme that you've seen in Baltimore the last couple of years. You've got Frazier, who knows that scheme, is malleable in terms of he's also run other schemes. He's a long-term vet, one of those guys that just likes to coach ball and knows defense. You've got a defensive coordinator / defensive line coach who's coming over from Dan Quinn and that scheme. And you've got a secondary coach who is really well thought of, who is out of the Alabama Nick Saban coaching tree at defensive backs, which is a different defensive scheme. And you've got a lot of different ideas, a lot of different experiences, expertise.
I will add that they signed linebackers coach Kirk Olivadotti as a coach too. He's 50 years old, been around coaching in the NFL for 20 years. Well-respected linebackers coach. That's a Mike Macdonald hire, and linebackers are very instrumental in his scheme, and that's a good hire.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I like that hire. I did not read that one yet, but yeah, no, I like that hire a lot. That's a lot of. But you're right. That's a Mike Macdonald hire. He'd
spent the previous 5 years with the Green Bay Packers as their inside linebackers coach, and Washington Redskins for 4 years before that as their linebackers coach. So, well-respected guy, came from Georgia before that.
Yep.
And then we hired a Harbaugh too.
Yes, a special teams coordinator,
Jay Harbaugh. If you look at Michigan special teams, those are actually well coached, and so that's a pretty decent hire.
Yeah, he knew that Harbaugh from his time at Michigan. He also knows the Harbaughs because he coached under one in Baltimore. Right. I was a little, I don't want to say disappointed in that hire, but it was because it's not him, or the fact that he's a Harbaugh.
You just wanted to retain the guy we had.
But I liked Izzo.
Yeah.
I thought he did a great job. And I thought as a former special teams, ace himself, he really understood all the details.
And our units performed well.
Yeah, and even with injuries, and you had new guys rotating in and out, and the guys were coached well. They knew what they're doing. I liked having Izzo there. I thought he would be a candidate to be retained, and I was a little sad to see him not. But okay, I mean, Michigan's special teams were part of the reason why they won a national title.
Yeah,
and not
he was around that team for a while. Saw all that success. Yeah.
And so
it's interesting.
Did a good job with that group.
It's interesting to me, you and I, when you take a look at the off season, one of the reasons why we've kind of held off a little bit talking about prospects is because we've been trying to wait a little bit, be patient with this coaching hire, because there's really not a lot of in-depth conversation to be had if you don't know
what the scheme is.
There's an order of operations, right? You got to know what you're going to run. And now that we've got this in place, we can kind of figure it out. We put the puzzle together. And this is one of the fun parts about what we do and what we're most interested in following football in general is roster building, how it all fits together, the salary cap, the strategy, how you blend free agents in key spots with the draft, and all of this. It all works together. And I'm kind of excited now that we've gone through this process on the show and we've talked about all these guys and how they might all fit together and so forth. There's a pretty decent blend of new ideas with old school guys that have been around for a while that know the nuts and bolts of how to get players in the right positions to be successful. And it starts at the top, really. When you talk about Mike Macdonald, he's only got a couple of years of success, but he had a meteoric rise in the Ravens organization, and very, very well thought of in the league circles. And I think that hire was a knock out of the park hire if you're wanting to completely change the direction of where you're at as a franchise and a team. And John Schneider really did kind of do that. So hats off there. And then Leslie Frazier, I think we didn't talk about him in this show yet, but we've talked about him before as the former longtime defensive coordinator mind and assistant head coach now with the Seahawks. I think really kind of
and with head
all
coaching
together
experience
and takes that dough ball and really kind of now starts to mold it into something with these guys.
The Leslie Frazier hire makes the rest of this work. And that's not to say that Macdonald couldn't have, but he's 36. He's never been a head coach.
You talked about guys respecting him right away and what he says and try and maybe trump him a little bit as far as the hierarchy of where some of these assistants sit. And Leslie won't allow that to happen.
Yeah, he's going to come in and he brings that level of experience. He knows he's done it himself as far as running a staff and being the guy. And he'll be able to counsel Macdonald on how to handle certain situations and that kind of stuff. And he's just going to be this incredible resource to help Macdonald get his feet under him. I know I keep bringing it up, but it's very similar to what Sean McVay did, right? And bringing in his defensive coordinator. God damn it, I can see his face, but I wasn't his name. He was only Wade Phillips.
You mean
was only with him for a couple of years.
Okay.
But he longtime coach, been a head coach a couple of times, really well respected. But he brought in that experience. People were worried. They were like, oh, that's going to create like a conflict. People are going to look to the more experienced guy. No, Wade Phillips was there to be an advisor and a counsel to help Sean McVay, not to override him. And it was a fantastic move by McVay to hire him. The same way that I think Leslie Frazier is, but this is a fantastic move. Now, you can remember that.
And they have background together.
Yeah, Macdonald was when Frazier was a head coach. Macdonald was his defensive quality control guy. He was the guy that dotted I's and crossed T's for Frazier on the defensive side of the ball and made sure that things weren't getting missed and things weren't getting like all of that. And so they worked together pretty closely. And Frazier was like, no, I want to work with this guy. I want to work with this guy. And that says a lot. Says a lot.
Yeah. It's all right. So most of the stuff's done. There's a passing game coordinator, running game coordinator. I think those are going to be important hires for our offensive coordinator and for this team. But most of this thing is kind of done. Throw out a grade for me. Like, how did John Schneider do?
I'll give him a B. I really love the Macdonald hire. And if you can't tell, I love the Leslie Frazier hire. I think the coordinators are so much of an unknown. I would have, you bring in Eric Bieniemy to be the guy on the offensive side, and this becomes an A. But they didn't want to do that. They didn't want someone who has head coach aspirations next year and therefore might try and insert himself more than he needed to. But still, it would have been a guy with proven track record and experience and all of that, whereas Grubb's kind of an unknown.
Yeah.
So we'll see. And then on the DC side, you've got a coach that's never done it, and you're bringing in his ideas and his experience with a different system, which is helpful. But I mean, are you bringing in Clint Hurt 2.0?
You're bringing in Mike Macdonald assistants because that's basically what it's going to be.
True. But you get what I'm saying, right? People would have said, oh, well, you bring, doesn't matter what Clint Hurt knows or does, whatever. It's Pete Carroll's defense. Well, and then it didn't happen that way because I'm just saying, like,
Hayden Durd could end up being like the most important hire in this entire process. We don't know yet. This
Yeah,
is
we
one
don't
of
know.
those.
And
This guy
that's what
needs
I'm
to
saying
kind
is
of prove it over time.
because we don't know all of this, I'm reluctant to give it an A. I'll give it a B. A B is still a good grade. So
I agree. I totally agree with that grade. I think that's fair. There's too many unknowns to give this anything higher than that, and even that might be generous in this approach. Now, I think Mike Macdonald deserves a ton of praise and so forth, but he's also new to this as well. Just to keep that thing in perspective, we've seen coaches that have all the fanfare in the world, all the well intentions, all that stuff, and just fall flat for whatever reason. It just happens. It's the NFL. It beats people up, tosses them aside quickly if you're not prepared, not ready. There's no way of knowing if he's prepared and ready other than you're trusting John Schneider and his judgment to hire the best qualified candidate possible, and he did.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
I mean, I look at this, and I one of the things that I for some reason just think of is he's the 9th head coach in Seahawks history, and of the previous 8, you include Dennis Erickson, Flores, and Jim Mora, right?
Yeah.
Right. But the other ones, right, have all been there a long time. Pete Carroll, Mike Holmgren, Chuck Knox, right? And so I look at this and I go, this, if you think of it that way, this hire was made with the idea that it's going to be a long-term hire. This was not let's go get a guy, see if it works for a couple years, and then move on. This is not a Cliff Kingsbury hire. This is not a
3-year contract.
Yeah, it's a 6-year contract. This is
he's going to be given a little bit of leeway, isn't he?
He is. They expect him to be here a long time.
One thing I like about the John Schneider arrangement with Mike Macdonald on the coaches and so forth is some of the heat can be deflected off Mike Macdonald a little bit if things don't work out perfectly on the offensive coordinator side, for example. It gives him some leeway. It gives him some draft capital to put young players in position to be successful right away, as opposed to relying on veterans all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there's a mandate to win now necessarily, although I do think they want to be successful right away. I think there's an understanding there that there's probably a 2 or 3 year roster building process that Mike Macdonald needs to go through in order to replicate a Baltimore Ravens success story. They need some time to build a defense like that.
Yep. I look at, look at what happened with, and when Pete Carroll first came in, right? 7-9 the first 2 years. Granted, one of those was playoffs. And then things started to take off, like with, in 2012. It was a 3-year process to get the roster right. Now, this roster is in much better shape than the roster was when Pete Carroll took over. But okay, look at what happened with Mike Holmgren when he first got here, right? The first year they made the playoffs, but they backed in. They were like 8-2 and then ended up 9-7 and but somehow still made
Let me ask you this. You brought up some
time.
great things. You brought up a great thing and it just brought it into my brain. I want to ask you this and we can get out of here. How much pressure is going to be on Mike Macdonald and John Schneider to spend money this year and push money out into 2025-26 in order to get this roster more formed than maybe it's ready to be?
I don't know if there is going to be. Because if they look at this and they've sold this to Jody Allen, that what we were doing wasn't working and we were never going to get there because we were stuck as a just barely making the playoffs team or just barely not making the playoff team.
As a win now franchise because of Pete Carroll.
Yeah. And so we need to take a very short 1 year step back in order to get the roster right. I don't know if there's win now. They can't go 4-13 because then they're gonna be like, oh, you fired Pete Carroll. 9-8 wasn't good enough, so you went 4-13. You know what I mean? You can't do that. But you can take a step back for 1 year and work to get the roster right, and then they have to step forward in year 2. That's where I think that you've got to be. But I don't think there's a lot of pressure to win right now. But they're also not going to. They're not going to tank. And so I think that you're in a situation where that's why I think they go get their quarterback this year, because you want that in place so that in year 2, they've already got them. They're in the system. They've been learning. They've got some playing time. They've had a full off season of scouting their own tape and improving and all of that before they go into year 2. Because year 2 is when, quarterbacks take that major step. I mean, look what happened to Russ in his second year, right? They won a Super Bowl in his second year. And so I think they do that now because they have this 1 year where if they tread water a little bit while they get the roster moved and they get a quarterback acclimated and they make that transition, then they can. So I don't think they're going to be pushing a lot of money out into the future because they want the ability to go win in the future. And 2024 isn't the year that you sacrifice the future for. Your future is not 2024. It's 2025 and 2026. And so you've got to do some things. You're going to have to make stuff work. You may have to trade Tyler Lockett rather than extend him and push money out forward, because you don't want to push the money out forward. And instead you want to get a second round pick for him and, make the team younger and all of that. And you'd hate to lose him because everyone freaking loves Tyler Lockett and he's amazing, but
he would probably need to have some sort of restructure though, before you trade him. Cause I don't think there's a team out there that would take a $27 million cap hit on Tyler Lockett.
But they don't take the $27 million cap hit. It's $27 million for Seattle because Seattle has his salary and the prorated part of his signing bonus. The team that takes him on when the trade does not have that signing bonus portion. That stays with Seattle. And so it wouldn't be.
And his base is like 17 or something like that, right?
Which is more than reasonable for given a top 25 receiver in the league. So I think
it'll be so interesting. I mean, I love this. I love these conversations because it's just going to be so interesting. The approach for every player that's currently on the roster under contract and any free agents that we're in play for and how much money we generate. It just really gives a tell on their approach for the entire process. And so it'd be fascinating to watch this up close this year as we transition from the Pete Carroll era to now the Mike Macdonald era of Seahawks football and the John Schneider era, really. I mean, John's been involved, but now it's his baby.
He's been involved,
I wish him nothing
but it
but
was
success,
Pete Carroll's team.
Obviously.
It was Pete Carroll's team. Now, John's fingerprints were all over it, but it was Pete Carroll's team. And what I'm curious about is the win now moves, the trades for Clowney and Leonard Williams and all those, those were win now moves. Sacrifice the future for now.
Tight ends and punt returners and all sorts of, win now things that were questionable even then.
Yeah.
Right.
How much of that was Pete Carroll? How much of that was John Schneider? We don't know, and they'll never tell us. And people who will speculate and whatever, but the truth is we don't know.
Here's one thing for sure. John Schneider made those trades happen. So Pete said, go get somebody, and John made it happen. John is an experienced executive. And, the good news is he does have experience swinging for the fences and getting stuff done when needed. It'll be interesting to see if now they step back away and you won't see those things for a little bit, or they're one-offs now and again. Similar to what the Ravens did with Raekwon Smith.
Schneider came from the Green Bay organization, which under Ron Wolf
Very
and company was very conservative. They would never trade those picks. They would never do that. And he came to Seattle and became very aggressive.
Hey,
and
Pete.
the opposite of that.
Let's
and
go.
and
Right.
Okay, but so all of that, like, who is John Schneider on that spectrum? Is he Ron Wolf, who is the ultra conservative, never trade picks for vets, or was he what we've seen in Seattle under Pete Carroll, where it's like, go get Clowney, go get all these guys, and what's the expectation there? Who is Schneider? Like, what is his, now that he doesn't have someone calling the shots and telling him, hey, yeah, let's do this and let's not do this, and the buck stops with him and every decision is his decision. Who is he? We don't know.
The self-analysis would be fascinating. Because he needs to now analyze his role in all of that to figure out what he's going to carry forward, what success looks like for him. And does it include those things, or does he recognize that maybe some of those things were added difficulty long-term to the franchise? The
sustained success of the Pete Carroll era,
despite
giving up first-round picks for guys that were on the roster for a year, which is typically a disastrous decision, unless you win a title. These were disastrous decisions that somehow didn't stop the team from continuing to have success, which I think spoke a lot to John Schneider's ability to find guys in late rounds.
Yeah.
And that's the part that Pete Carroll's not going to be involved in, because
he doesn't know. I think the idea that John's involved in every deal in the NFL, that sort of mystique, I think that continues, and when you're involved, you have the potential to unleash whatever it is that you want to do. If he was involved in every deal and never made any deals, then teams would stop paying attention to him. Yeah,
but then you're the Portland Trail Blazers.
Right.
Anyways, let's wrap this up. We're over an hour, and it's going to be a nice day out, and I want to go outside.
Well, it was good talking to you on a Saturday, Keith, as always. So find Keith on Twitter at Mars NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show is at Hawks Playbook on Twitter. Seahawks Playbook Podcast is the show. You can find us on your favorite podcast platforms and our YouTube channel. And when you do, hit the subscribe button. That would be great. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.